History is a story told by the victors, but what truths vanish when the storytellers decide to lie? Elara, a young archivist, believed the greatest heroes were deliberately erased from memory. Driven by a thirst for truth, she broke a sacred decree and entered the sealed Hall of Whispers, a place forbidden by the High Chronicler himself. She knew she risked exile and the wrath of the entire ruling council, but she had to recover the lost tales before the last living witnesses to these events faded away forever. By the end of this journey, you will discover the 24 battles that never made the Chronicles and the unsung heroes who fought them. What secret was so dangerous it had to be erased from history? And what did Elara find in that dark hall that changed everything? I am curious, wherever you are listening from right now, would you mind sharing what your local time is? What does it mean for a hero to be truly forgotten? The air in the Hall of Whispers was thick with the dust of ages, but one corner held a different kind of density. A faint, sapphire glow pulsed from behind a collapsed shelf. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed the rotten wood aside, revealing a small alcove carved directly into the stone. There, resting on a pedestal of obsidian, was a single, perfect memory crystal. It hummed with a low, resonant energy that vibrated through her bones. Her training screamed that this was a violation, a direct breach of the High Chronicler's most sacred decree. But the pull was irresistible. Her fingers, trembling, closed around the cool, smooth surface. The moment she touched it, the world dissolved into light and sound. She was no longer in the silent hall. She stood on a windswept mountain pass, the air sharp with the scent of pine and blood. A warrior named Kalin, his armor scarred and broken, stood alone against a tide of shifting, shadowy forms. They were not quite solid, their edges blurring like smoke, and their silence was more terrifying than any war cry. Kalin fought with a desperate, graceful fury, his every movement a defiant denial of the inevitable. He was not holding the pass for glory or for a king. He was holding it for a caravan of fleeing civilians, their distant lights twinkling like fallen stars in the valley far below. Elara felt every impact, every surge of his fading strength, the raw, unvarnished truth of his sacrifice searing into her soul. This was a battle that had saved thousands, and it had been erased. The vision shattered, hurling her back into the dark, cold silence of the hall. She collapsed to her knees, gasping, the phantom scent of blood still in her nostrils. A profound exhaustion, deeper than any mere physical tiredness, weighed her down, and beneath that fatigue, something else lingered. A psychic echo, a faint whisper of Kalin's final, determined thought, now etched into her own mind. It was a beacon, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that its activation had been felt. Somewhere, in the deep and hidden places of the world, a silent, ancient order had just stirred. They now knew the seal was broken. As she staggered to her feet, the foundation of her life crumbled. The official chronicles she had spent her youth studying were not just incomplete. They were a deliberate, calculated lie. The weight of that deception was suffocating. Her duty to the archives now felt like complicity. Clutching the now dormant crystal, she made her choice. She would not report this. She would hide her discovery and seek out more of these hidden truths. This was no longer mere curiosity. It was a quest. The personal risk was immense. Every moment she spent in the hall, every crystal she found, brought her closer to exposure and exile. But the greater horror was the scope of the conspiracy she had uncovered. An entire order of heroes, their sacrifices, their very existences, had been systematically wiped from memory. Who had the power to do such a thing, and why? As she carefully concealed the alcove once more, she felt a new presence in the silence. It was not the peaceful quiet of a library. It was the hunting silence of a predator. The watchers were awake, and they had begun their search for the one who dared to listen to the whispers. The phantom scent of pine and blood clung to Elara's clothes for days, a constant reminder of Kalin's sacrifice. The memory crystal was safely hidden, but its truth was a fire in her mind she could not extinguish. To understand the conspiracy, she needed a voice from the world outside the archives, someone who remembered the stories the Chronicles had tried to bury. Her research, cross-referencing forgotten supply routes with censored poetry, led her to the slums, to a crumbling tenement that smelled of damp stone and boiled roots. Here lived Lyra, a blind storyteller, so old she was said to be a living library herself. Convincing Lyra to speak was its own battle. The old woman's milky eyes seemed to see straight through Elara's archivist robes, sensing the danger she carried. It was only when Elara whispered Kalin's name, a name that should have been dust, that Lyra's resistance broke. In a voice cracked with age and disuse, she sang a forbidden song, her fingers plucking a mournful melody from a worn lute. It was the Ballad of the Weeping Willows. The official history recorded it as a catastrophic military defeat, a lesson in the folly of a stubborn general. But Lyra's song told a different tale. It spoke of a deliberate, heart-wrenching sacrifice. The general, a woman now reviled in the Chronicles, had held the line at the Willow Grove, not out of pride, but to allow a plague-stricken city farther down the river to complete a desperate evacuation. Her forces were not defeated. They were spent, their lives the currency paid for 10,000 others, and the song named the one who had ordered the cover-up, a name that struck Elara dumb with disbelief. It was Valerius, the founder of the archives, the most revered figure in all of recorded history. The last note of the song hung in the air, a damning accusation, when the heavy tread of armored boots echoed in the alley below. The city guards, ever suspicious of gatherings that fostered unapproved memories, were raiding the building. Elara acted without thought. She grabbed Lyra's arm, ignoring the woman's protests, and pulled her into the tenement's rotting interior. Her years of memorizing the archive's architectural scrolls, including the forgotten servant passages and sewage tunnels that connected to the older parts of the city, became her map to survival. They fled through dripping, narrow darkness, the shouts of the guards fading behind them. In that moment, Elara was not just breaking a rule, she was burning her entire life as an archivist, severing her last tie to the authority that had raised her. She had become a fugitive, and the political powers she had challenged now had a face and a name to hunt. But as they emerged into a hidden courtyard, Lyra's frail hand tightened on her arm. The old storyteller was no longer a source. She was the first true ally in a war for truth, her blind eyes now fixed on the path ahead. Lyra's song gave more than a name. It held a hidden verse, a list of craftsmen who served the forgotten cause. One name stood out, Boren the smith, whose family anvil was said to ring with the memory of lost steel. Finding him meant navigating the industrial underbelly of the city, a labyrinth of scorching forges and acrid smoke. His workshop was tucked away in a dead-end alley, its door scarred and its windows shuttered. Boren was a mountain of a man, his face hard as the iron he pounded, and his distrust was a tangible wall. He refused to speak of the old songs, his eyes darting nervously to the shadows. It was only when Elara mentioned the weeping willows that his demeanor shifted. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw the same desperate need for truth. That was when the thugs arrived. They moved with an unnatural silence, their movements too fluid, their eyes glowing with a faint, sickly green light. They were not common street enforcers. They were magically enhanced, their strength and speed far beyond any normal human. They came for the Anvil, the great, ancient block of iron that had been in Boren's family for generations. Boren grabbed a heavy hammer, his roar one of defiance, but he was one man against six. Elara was no warrior, but she was an archivist. She knew the precise angles of the cramped forge, the weak points in the stone floor, the placement of every quenching trough. She did not fight them directly. She created chaos. She kicked a stack of iron rods to trip one, swung a chain to disrupt another's charge, and used a bucket of water to short-circuit the strange energy that shimmered around a third. Her actions were not graceful, but they were effective, buying Boren the precious seconds he needed. Together, they drove the attackers back into the night. In the forge's flickering light, Boren's gratitude was a quiet, solemn thing. He led her to the great anvil, its surface pitted and stained with centuries of work. He poured a special oil over it, and as the liquid settled, a pattern emerged. Etched into the metal by some long-lost art was not a map of roads, but a map of stars, a constellation aligned with a single, stark symbol of a broken shield. This, Boren said, his voice rough with emotion, marks the Ashen Fields. It is a mass grave, a field of the dead, from a battle so terrible, its name was scoured from the world. My great-grandfather helped bury them. He forged the markers that were later torn down. The enemy was no longer a vague conspiracy. They had faces, enhanced abilities, and a clear mission to destroy any physical evidence of the past. Elara's quest had escalated from a secret search for truth to a physically dangerous fight for survival. Staring at the star map on the anvil, she made her choice. She would go to the Ashen Fields. It was a desolate, cursed place, shunned by all sensible travelers, but she had to see it for herself. She had to stand on that ground and bear witness to the silence. Someone had to remember the names buried in that ash. The journey to the Ashen Fields was a trek through a land that memory itself had abandoned. Nothing grew in the gray soil, and the wind carried a fine, whispering dust that tasted of old sorrow. Elara stood at the center of that vast, silent plain, the weight of countless unmarked graves pressing down on her. Following Lyra's careful instructions, she cleared a small circle of earth and began the ritual. It was not a chant of power, but a simple, heartfelt recitation of the few names Boren had remembered. She spoke them aloud into the oppressive silence, offering them back to the wind. The air grew cold, and the ashen ground began to swirl. Figures of faint, blue light emerged from the soil, not as terrifying apparitions, but as weary soldiers. Their collective memory washed over her, and she was pulled into their final moments. This was the silent stand, The enemy had not been an army of men, but a creeping, magical plague that twisted living flesh into monstrous forms. These soldiers did not fight to win. They formed a living perimeter, a containment wall, knowing that the plague within would inevitably claim them. They stood their ground in absolute silence to avoid drawing more of the infected to their location, their sacrifice ensuring the plague starved itself out and never reached the populated lowlands. Their commander's final order was not a cry to attack, but a whisper to hold the line forever. The profound sorrow of the vision was shattered by a piercing shriek. A form of concentrated malice and shadow coalesced from the disturbed air, a spectral warden. Its form flickered with corrupted green energy, the same she had seen in the thugs at Boren's forge. This spirit was not a guardian of the dead, but an eraser, bound to destroy any who remembered this place. It lunged for her, its touch promising not just death, but utter oblivion. Elara had no weapon to fight it. Her only defense was the truth it was created to destroy. As the warden closed in, she did not run. She stood her ground, just as the soldiers had, and she began to speak. She shouted the names of the fallen, the names Boren's family had secretly preserved. With every name, the warden flinched, its form rippling as if struck. She spoke of their sacrifice, of the plague they contained, of the lives they saved by their silent, terrible choice. The warden's attacks grew more frantic, but less coordinated. The truth was unmaking it. She saw then that the warden was not purely evil, but a tortured soul itself, a captured spirit, forced into this cruel duty. To destroy it would be to complete the enemy's work, so she made a choice that terrified her more than any physical fight. As the warden recoiled from the barrage of truth, she reached out with her mind, not to push it away, but to pull it in. She opened herself to its tormented memories, absorbing the centuries of enforced silence, the agony of destroying every tribute and whisper dedicated to the very heroes it may have once known. The pain was excruciating, a psychic scream that seared her soul. But as the warden's form dissolved into a shower of harmless light, a final, clear image burned into her mind, a symbol of a tall, slender tower reflected in a still, black lake. Elara collapsed to her knees, vomiting nothing but dry heaves onto the ash. She was free, but she was not alone in her mind anymore. A lingering echo of the warden's torment was now a permanent resident within her, a cold knot of sorrow tied to her own spirit. Remembering was no longer an intellectual pursuit. It was a physical and emotional burden she had to carry. The cost of restoring a single truth had been a piece of her own peace. And yet, that painful union had given her a vital clue. The spectral warden, and by extension, the enemies who controlled it, were connected to a place, a real location her archival knowledge could identify. The fight had moved from the forgotten past to a tangible present, and the path forward was now terrifyingly clear. The slender tower, reflected in a black lake, was the spire of Lorien, a place the archives listed as a ruin lost to a swamp. Elara knew its true location, a secret the warden's torment had seared into her mind, but the path there was a ghost, erased from all modern charts. To find it, she needed a mapmaker who dealt in truths the world had tried to bury. His name was Oren, and he was said to live in the high cliffs, a man so paranoid he trusted only the language of strategy. She found his dwelling behind a waterfall, a cave filled with scroll cases, and the scent of old ink. Boren was a sharp, bird-like man whose eyes held the weight of 1,000 campaigns. He did not ask her why she had come. He simply laid out a complex board of polished stones and carved obsidian pieces. To earn a single look at his life's work, she would have to win a game of kings and pawns. The board was a tactical simulation, and as the game began, Elara realized each move recreated a dilemma from a forgotten battle. Here was the choice to sacrifice a flank to save a supply line. There, the decision to abandon a fortified position for a risky ambush. Boren was not just testing her skill. He was testing her understanding of the very history she sought to reclaim. She played well, using her archival knowledge of classic maneuvers, but Boren was a master, his defenses impenetrable. He was slowly, methodically dismantling her forces. Desperation clawed at her. Then, the memory of the Ashen Fields surfaced, the silent soldiers holding their doomed perimeter. They did not fight to win, they fought to contain. In a move that broke every conventional rule of the game, she deliberately sacrificed her king piece, offering it up to shatter Boren's central formation. It was a loss by any standard measure, a complete surrender. Boren froze, his hand hovering over the board. The move was not one of defeat, but of a deeper, more terrible victory. "You play like General Valeria at the Weeping Willows," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "You sacrificed the battle to win the war." No one remembers that strategy, no one but the descendants of those who were saved by it. The game was over. He had not been seeking a winner, he had been seeking a kindred spirit. Boren carefully unrolled a massive vellum scroll across his stone table. It was a map of breathtaking detail, showing coastlines and mountain ranges that did not exist on any public chart. 24 locations were marked with small, elegant symbols: a broken shield, a wilted willow, a silent bell. This was the Cartographer's Gambit, a lifetime of work dedicated to preserving what the official record had destroyed. He pointed to the first symbol, a place called the Sunken city of Terivos. "I will take you there," he said. "My great-grandfather commanded the rear guard. I owe him this." Elara was no longer a lone archivist chasing whispers. She had a guide who understood the terrain, both physical and historical. Their quest had just evolved from a search for forgotten stories into a coordinated campaign to reclaim them. The water of the Black Lake was a cold shock, swallowing the world of light and air in an instant. Elara followed Finian, the Cartographer, down into the gloom, their descent into the sunken city of Thalassia, feeling like a journey into a drowned memory. The ruins were skeletal, great arches and toppled statues, draped in swaying weeds, and the silence was broken only by the frantic rhythm of their own breathing through the enchanted reeds. Their goal was a memorial obelisk, said to stand in the central plaza, a record of a naval battle against Leviathans that the Chronicles had reclassified as a mythical storm. But the city's guardians remained. They came from the dark doorways, not as spirits, but as things of flesh and nightmare, crabs the size of hounds with jagged, glowing claws, and eels whose bodies shimmered with a corrupt, violet light. These were not natural creatures. They were mutations, twisted by the same ancient magic that had summoned the Leviathans centuries before, and they were fiercely territorial. Finian fought with a pragmatic ferocity, using a weighted knife to break through shells and sever slick tails. Elara, armed only with a short blade, relied on evasion and the terrain, kicking off crumbling walls to avoid snapping jaws. The disorienting environment was their greatest enemy. Every movement churned the silt, clouding the water and reducing visibility to a few desperate feet. The constant, gnawing awareness of their limited air supply turned each second into a frantic race against drowning. When they finally reached the central plaza and the towering, algae-crusted obelisk, the relief was short-lived. More of the mutated creatures were converging, their glowing forms flickering in the murk like malevolent stars. Finian gestured urgently toward the surface, his eyes wide with warning. But Elara saw the names. Carved deep into the stone were the names of every sailor, every marine, every cook who had stood on the decks of the forgotten fleet and held the line against the colossal beasts to prevent a coastal invasion. To leave now was to let them be forgotten again. Ignoring Finian's protests, she unspooled her precious, oiled parchment and a piece of charcoal. With the creatures closing in, she began to rub, her hands moving with a desperate speed, transferring the etched names onto the durable scroll. It was a choice that defied all survival instinct, placing the preservation of a dead past above their living, breathing present. Finian stood his ground, a lone defender against the onslaught, buying her the precious moments she needed. The last name was secured just as a deep, resonant groan echoed through the water, a sound that vibrated in their bones. It was not the sound of any creature they had seen. It was older and infinitely more vast. Their struggle, the disturbance in this sacred, cursed place, had been a dinner bell. Something that had slept in the lightless trenches for generations was now awake, and it was hungry. They kicked for the surface, the proof of the battle clutched in Elara's hand, but the victory felt hollow. They had recovered the first undeniable evidence, a list of names that contradicted official history, but they had also traded one enemy for another far more terrifying. The ancient masters of the Leviathans were no longer a historical footnote. They were a rising threat in the deep, and their attention was now fixed squarely on the two who dared to remember. The proof from the sunken city was a weapon, a list of names that contradicted the crown's official history. Elara knew the Thalassian Admiral, Lord Thuron, had been publicly branded a traitor for his supposed cowardice. Her research pointed to his last living descendant, a man named Kalin, who now bore the weight of that shame in a decaying manor on the city's outskirts. The air in his ancestral home was thick with the scent of old wine and bitterness. Gideon was a young man with the weary eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime being spat upon. He greeted her not with curiosity, but with a cold, sharp blade held to her throat, convinced she was another agent sent to torment his family. Elara did not flinch. She met his gaze and spoke a single sentence, the truth she had pulled from the sunken obelisk. Your ancestor did not retreat. He drew the Leviathan away from the civilian fleet, sacrificing his own ship and his reputation to lead the monster into a magically charged trench. He died a hero, not a coward. She unrolled the charcoal rubbing, the names of Thuron's crew shining in the dim light as undeniable witness. The blade clattered to the stone floor. Kadin's hostility shattered, replaced by a profound, trembling confusion. The foundation of his entire life, the story of his family's disgrace, was a lie crafted by the very crown they had saved. He led her to a hidden panel behind a family portrait, retrieving a chest of journals bound in salt-stained leather. "These are his logs," he whispered, his voice raw. "And the logs of other commanders our family quietly allied with, all of them erased." As Elara's fingers touched the first journal, a loose shutter across the street snapped shut. They were being watched. Royal spies, assigned to ensure the Thuron name remained synonymous with betrayal, had seen everything. Shouts echoed from the street as guards moved to secure the perimeter. There was no time for deliberation. Elara made a choice born of desperate necessity. She trusted him. She grabbed Kadin's arm and told him of the hidden archive, the Hall of Whispers, giving him its secret entrance. They fled through a root cellar that opened into the city's ancient sewers, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. Kadin was no longer just a source of information. He was a fugitive, his family's legacy now actively weaponized against the state. The conspiracy was no longer a shadowy, ancient order. It was the crown itself, the current government, which relied on those old lies to maintain its power. The enemy had a throne, an army, and the legal authority to brand them all as traitors. The quest for forgotten heroes had just become an act of treason. The sewers offered temporary refuge, but the truth Elara carried was a weight that threatened to drown her. To understand the pattern behind the erasure, she needed more than dusty journals and star maps. She needed to see the threads of fate themselves. This led her to a place beyond the crown's authority, a hidden grove where a coven of seers watched the tapestry of time, their loyalty sworn not to kings, but to destiny's balance. They were neutral, ancient, and notoriously difficult to find, but the Warden's echo in her mind resonated with their timeless magic, guiding her steps. The grove was a place of impossible quiet, where the air shimmered and the very leaves seemed to hold their breath. The seers, robed in gray, moved like ghosts between the trees, their faces unreadable. Their leader, an ageless woman named Boren, listened as Elara spoke of Kalin, the weeping willows, and the sunken city. When she finished, Boren's response was a chilling calm. "The truth you seek is a poison, child. Some memories are a cancer on the timeline, and amputation is the only cure. To see why, you must endure a trial by vision. It is a burden that has broken stronger souls. The trial was not a test of strength, but of empathy. Elara was led to a still pool at the grove's heart. As she gazed into its depths, she did not see her reflection. She was plunged, mind and soul, into a cascade of forgotten moments. She felt the despair of a commander, ordering a retreat to lure an enemy into a trap, knowing his name would be synonymous with failure for all time. She lived the final, gasping breaths of a healer who sacrificed her own life force to create a cure for a magical plague, only to have her discovery credited to a charlatan. She stood with a diplomat who brokered a peace by accepting the blame for a massacre he did not commit, his reputation shredded to prevent a wider war. She experienced not one, but a dozen such sacrifices simultaneously, the collective emotional weight of 100 erased heroes crashing into her spirit. It was an ocean of sorrow, of quiet dignity, of love for people who would never know their names. When the vision released her, she was on her hands and knees, weeping uncontrollably, her body trembling with phantom pains and a profound, soul-deep grief. She was scarred, her mind now a mosaic of other people's pain, but the trial had left a mark. As her vision cleared, she saw faint, golden halos of light around the Seers, echoes of their own past acts of quiet courage. She could now, temporarily, see the potential for heroism in others. It was a magical boon, but it came with a heavy toll. Every echo she saw was a reminder of the pain she now carried within. The coven was divided. Some seers saw her resilience as a sign that the timeline could bear the weight of these restored truths. Others, led by a stern seer named Kalin, a name that sent a shiver down Elara's spine, argued vehemently for the status quo. To restore these memories is to unravel the careful peace we have cultivated, Kalin insisted. The world is stable because it forgets its most painful choices. You would trade that stability for a truth that will only cause more suffering. Elara pushed herself to her feet, her voice raw but steady. You call this stability, but it is a cage built on graves. Fate cannot be woven from lies. A destiny that requires the utter annihilation of love and sacrifice is not a balance worth preserving. It is a slow death for the human spirit. She looked at Morwen, her eyes holding the pain of 100 forgotten souls. Their sacrifice matters, not for glory, but because the choice to be good in a dark moment is what truly shapes our fate. To erase that is to make the world a colder, weaker place. Morwen observed her for a long, silent moment, the grove itself seeming to wait for her judgment. Finally, she spoke. The child of the archives sees more clearly than the guardians of fate. Your point has merit. We will grant you conditional aid passage, warnings, and limited counsel. But know this, the path you walk no longer challenges just a king or a chronicler. It challenges the very story we tell ourselves to survive. The schism within the grove now mirrored the conflict in the world outside. The quest had transformed from a historical correction into a philosophical war over the soul of memory itself. The quarry was a wound in the earth, a vast, terraced pit where forgotten machines lay like skeletal giants. Their goal was the Sentinel, a massive stone golem, slumped against the highest cliff, its form overgrown with thorny vines. According to the Cartographer's map, this quarry was the site of the Golem's last march, a battle where animated stone had held back an entire army to protect a valley of refugees. To learn the truth, they had to wake the Guardian. The reactivation was not a gentle process. As Cadden and Finian channeled energy into the ancient runes on its chest, the ground began to tremble. The great stone head lifted, its eyes glowing with a dull, hostile red, but its awakening was a signal. From cracks in the rock and dark mine shafts, a swarm of smaller constructs emerged, jagged, spider-like things of shale and granite, their single purpose to defend their master from all intruders. The fight was frantic and perilous. They were driven up the quarry's precarious scaffolding, wooden planks groaning under their weight. The golem itself was the greatest threat, its massive fists slamming down, shattering the platforms around them. They couldn't fight it, they could only evade, their survival a desperate dance on the edge of a long drop. Elara knew brute force was useless. As a stone fist smashed the ledge she stood on, she focused her seer-gifted sight, looking past the hostile magic controlling the giant. She saw the echoes, faint golden threads of loyalty and a deep, abiding sorrow were woven into its stone heart. This was not a mindless automaton. It was a grieving protector. While her allies held off the swarming smaller constructs, She climbed, her hands tearing on sharp rock. She reached the golem's chest, placing her palms flat against the cold stone over its core. She didn't try to command it. Instead, she poured her own memories into it, the echoes of sacrifice she carried from the Ashen Fields and the Sunken city. And then, she showed it the one memory she sensed it longed for, the face of its creator, the gentle geomancer who had given it life and a purpose, not as a weapon, but as a shield. The red light in the golem's eyes flickered, shifting to a soft, steady blue. The crushing fists unclenched. The swarm of smaller constructs froze in place, then crumbled harmlessly into piles of rock. A deep, resonant hum vibrated from the giant, a sound of recognition and profound grief. It was now their ally. In that moment, their understanding of the enemy shattered. The conspiracy could manipulate kings and chroniclers, but it could not touch this. They had gained a powerful, non-living ally, a being immune to political influence, bribes, or fear. But the victory was a warning. The forces arrayed against them were not merely human. They commanded arcane powers and artificial entities, a hidden arsenal capable of erasing history on a physical, as well as a spiritual, level. The war for memory was being fought on a battlefield that was rapidly expanding beyond anything they had imagined. The petrified tree was a monument to lost time, its branches frozen in a silent scream against the sky. Inside, the Library of Dust was a cathedral of hushed decay, where entire histories were inscribed on the delicate, parchment-thin leaves of its inner walls. A single misplaced breath could erase a chapter. A heavy footfall could bring a shelf of millennia crashing down. Their goal was the Verdant War, a conflict the archives dismissed as an ecological myth. They had to find its story before the library's fragile equilibrium failed completely. The air itself felt brittle, thick with the scent of old pollen and the profound silence of things too fragile to last. Elara moved with the reverence of a mourner, her fingertips barely brushing the veins of each leaf, reading fragments of forgotten treaties and agricultural rights. Finian charted the structural weaknesses, his every step a calculated risk, while Cadden stood guard at the entrance, his hand on his sword, listening to the groans of the ancient wood. They were not just researchers, they were surgeons operating on a dying patient. The story of the Verdant War came to them in heartbreaking pieces. It was not a war of armies, but of druids against ascension, consuming blight that twisted life into monstrous, puppeted forms. They found a leaf describing the song of unmaking, a melody so pure it could untangle the blight's corruption, but which required the singers to sacrifice their own connection to the natural world. Another fragment told of a druid who transformed into a great, shielding oak, her body becoming a permanent wall against the decay, her consciousness fading into the slow thoughts of the tree. The narrative was there, but scattered like ashes in the wind. Then a deep, shuddering crack echoed through the chamber. A major support branch, weakened by age, was splintering. The library began to collapse in earnest, shelves of irreplaceable knowledge dissolving into cascades of fine, colored dust. In that moment of roaring chaos, Elara faced an impossible choice. She stood at a junction where one path led to a single, mostly intact branch, holding the complete history of the Verdant War. The other path branched into dozens of smaller limbs, each holding fragments of other forgotten conflicts. The sorrow of the Silver River, the last flight of the Griffon riders, tales she knew they would never find elsewhere. To save one was to lose the others forever. There was no time for debate, no room for a perfect solution. With a sob caught in her throat, she shouted to her allies and ran toward the Verdant War. She made the choice of a general on a losing battlefield, sacrificing the many to save the one. As the branch containing the Druid's saga was carefully lowered to safety, the rest of the library folded in on itself behind them, a whirlwind of 1,000,000 forgotten stories returning to dust. They stood outside, covered in the fine powder of lost worlds, the weight of their single victory crushing in its incompleteness. Elara had the truth, a complete and heroic tale ready to be told. But she had also become an agent of loss, a preserver who had willingly allowed a universe of other memories to die. The cost of remembering one hero was the permanent silencing of 1,000 others, and that guilt settled deep in her bones, a new and heavier ghost to carry forward. Gideon's exile was a fortress of his own making. He lived in a stone hut high in the wind-scoured crags, a man carved from the same granite as the mountains, his eyes holding the permanent shadow of a shame he refused to name. When Elara found him and spoke of the Battle of the Crying Stones, he did not shout or deny. He simply turned his back, his voice a low rumble of finality. "I am the man who ran. Leave me to my peace." It was not anger that guarded him, but a profound, calcified self-loathing. The official record branded him an oath breaker, and he had spent a lifetime believing it. Elara knew facts would not break through. He needed to remember the feeling, the impossible choice he had actually made. Using Finnion's precise maps and Cadden's burgeoning leadership, she orchestrated a desperate gamble. They recreated the final moments of the battle on a nearby slope, using timed flares to mimic the enemy's encirclement and positioning the team to represent the trapped refugee column Gideon had allegedly abandoned. When he emerged from his hut at the commotion, he saw the tableau, a perfect echo of that fateful day. The visual shock was not enough. Elara, her heart hammering, then did the unthinkable. She walked into the center of the mock battlefield, playing the part of the civilian leader who had secretly begged him for help. She shouted the exact words the archives had buried, the coded phrase from a dead general ordering him to break formation and become a scapegoat for a greater good. The memory did not return as a thought, but as a visceral flood. Gideon staggered, the mountain air suddenly thick with the phantom sense of smoke and fear. He remembered the general's grim face, the whispered order, the agonizing decision to let his own name be stained with cowardice so that hundreds could slip away unseen through a mountain pass. The shame that had defined him for decades crumbled in an instant, revealing the bedrock of the hero he had always been. He fell to his knees, not in weakness, but in release, the weight of a lifetime of disgrace finally lifted. The change in him was immediate and absolute. The broken man was gone, replaced by a tactical genius with a burning need for restitution. He pledged his sword and his strategic mind to Elara's cause without hesitation, becoming their unwavering head of security. With Gideon planning their movements, the quest transformed. They were no longer a group of scholars and outlaws reacting to threats. They became a proactive strike force, orchestrating raids on royal outposts that housed censored documents and deploying clever misdirection to protect their growing network of allies. The mission's very purpose deepened. It was no longer just about recovering lost stories. It became about healing the living, about restoring the honor of those who had been forced to wear the mask of a villain. Each name they cleared was a strategic victory against the crown's foundation of lies, and a personal triumph that strengthened their resolve. They were not just uncovering history, they were mending its broken spirits, one redeemed hero at a time. The air in the shadow market tasted of ozone and deceit. Nestled in the city's forgotten catacombs, the cavernous space thrummed with hushed voices and the clink of illicit goods, a place where history's darkest trinkets were bought and sold. Elara and Gideon moved through the crowd, their postures tense. They were not here for a relic of power, but for a mundane-sounding rarity, a stabilized ectoplasmic resonator, the only component that could prevent the volatile memory crystals from shattering under the weight of the truths they held. Their contact was a broker named Silas, a man whose smile was as sharp as the prices he commanded. His stall was a clutter of dangerous curios, and his eyes missed nothing. The barter was a verbal duel, a game of implied threats and unspoken knowledge. Gideon's military bearing was a liability here, a beacon of authority in a den that thrived on its absence. Silas demanded not just gold, but information. He wanted to know who they worked for, what they sought. Gideon offered a carefully constructed lie about eccentric collectors, but Silas' gaze lingered on Elara, on the way her fingers unconsciously brushed the pouch at her belt, where she kept the crystals. He saw the archivist in her, the seeker of truths. Intrigued, he finally agreed to the trade, handing over the small, humming device in exchange for a heavy purse of coin and a falsified lead on a royal patrol schedule. It was a victory that felt hollow the moment they left his stall. The ambush came in a narrow side tunnel, a dead end they had been expertly herded towards. 4 figures emerged from the shadows, their movements synchronized and silent, their weapons drawn. These were not common thugs. They moved with the cold precision of royal assassins. Silas had not just taken their money, he had sold them out, trading their location and description for a far greater price from the crown. Trust, they learned too late, was the most expensive currency in the market, and they had just paid for a betrayal. Trapped and outnumbered, Gideon positioned himself in front of Elara, his sword a gleaming barrier. But Elara knew a straight fight was a death sentence. Her mind raced. The resonator in her hand was their key to preserving history, a delicate piece of magic. But in that moment, it was also their only tool for survival. With a surge of desperate inspiration, she realized its stabilizing field could be overloaded, reversed into a concussive blast of raw psychic energy. It would be a one-time use, sacrificing the very thing they had risked everything to acquire. She made the choice in a heartbeat. Shouting a warning to Gideon, she slammed the device against the stone wall. There was no explosion of fire, but a silent, expanding sphere of blinding white light and disorienting force. It was a flashbang to the soul, a wave of mental static that slammed into their attackers, causing them to stagger, clutching their heads in agony. In the precious seconds of confusion, she and Gideon ran, fleeing back into the tangled darkness of the catacombs. They had escaped with their lives, but they had lost the resonator. The cost of their safety was the stabilization of the crystals, leaving the fragile histories they carried more vulnerable than ever. And now, their enemy knew they were not just scholars. They were resourceful, desperate, and active in the city's underworld. The The Crown now had a concrete lead, a description of their methods, and the knowledge that they would trade in the black market. The hunt was no longer a vague pursuit. It had become a targeted extraction, and the net around them was drawing tight. Rain lashed against the tower's stone, a relentless drumbeat against the old walls. The storm had been their cover, but it had also masked the approach of their hunters. The first warning was not a sound, but a sensation, a sudden drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the wind. The quiet men were here. The siege began in silence, as their name promised. Arrows tipped with soul-numbing magic slammed into the shutters, their impact a dull thud that splintered the wood. From below, the scrape of climbing claws on wet stone signaled attackers, scaling the sheer face. Gideon roared orders, organizing their desperate, multi-level defense. Kalin held the lower stairs, his blade a silver blur in the torchlight, parrying the thrusts of black-daggered figures who materialized from the shadows. Gideon fought from the broken ramparts, using his knowledge of siege warfare to hurl makeshift caltrops and boiling water down on the climbers. Elara was the anchor, her mind a frantic map of their dwindling options. She used her seer sight to spot the faint, sickly green auras of the attackers, calling out their positions moments before they struck. The tower became a chaotic symphony of clashing steel, shouted warnings, and the sizzle of hostile magic fizzling against stone. It was a brutal, close-quarters fight for every inch of the spiral staircase, a battle fought on vertigo, inducing ledges and in cramped, dark rooms. The turning point came when a magically enhanced brute, shrugging off Kalin's attacks, smashed through the door to their study. Finian was there, desperately trying to gather his precious maps. He fought with a cartographer's ferocity, using a rolled vellum scroll as a club and a heavy ink pot as a missile, but he was overwhelmed. Elara watched in frozen horror from the stairwell as two quiet men pinned his arms and a third clamped a dark metal collar around his neck. His struggle ceased instantly, his body going limp. In that single, agonizing second, Elara faced a choice that would haunt her forever. She could order a full, desperate charge into the study, a suicidal attempt to wrest Finian from their grasp. Or she could fall back, protect the remaining research, and get Gideon and Kalin out alive. She saw the bulk of their notes, the rubbings from the sunken city, the star charts from the Anvil, all moments from being seized or burned. Finian would have chosen the maps. With a strangled cry that was half sob, half command, she shouted the order to retreat. They fought their way up to the tower's peak, to a precarious rope bridge Finian himself had charted as an escape route. As they fled across the churning abyss, Elara looked back one last time. She saw Finian, conscious but paralyzed, being carried away into the storm, his life's work going up in flames behind him. The cold rain on her face could not wash away the heat of her failure. They had survived, but they had lost their guide, their friend. The war was no longer an abstract fight for forgotten truths. It was a deeply personal vow. They would get him back, and they would make the quiet men answer for what they had stolen. Stone remembers everything. It holds the memory of ancient seas and the weight of forgotten footsteps. With the stabilized resonator finally recovered from a second, more perilous trip to the black market, Elara stood before the pacified Golem in the heart of the quarry. Its blue eyes glowed with a patient light. This was not a simple question, an answer. It was a communion, a merging of her consciousness with the enduring memory of the earth itself. The golem would be her anchor, a conduit to the deep, slow thoughts of the mountain range. Gideon and Kalin stood guard, their faces grim, knowing she would be utterly defenseless. Elara placed her hands on the golem's cold chest, the resonator humming in her palm, and let her mind fall into the stone. The world dissolved into a crushing, timeless dark. She was not a person anymore, but an awareness flowing through veins of granite, feeling the immense pressure of ages. She saw the foundations of the world, the slow grind of continents, the birth of rivers. She sought a recent scar, a place of sharp, unnatural activity that violated the stone's ancient peace. The psychic feedback was a constant, grinding pain, like a headache that encompassed her entire soul. She pushed deeper, ignoring the strain, sifting through millennia of silence for a single, screaming anomaly, and then she found it. A fortress carved into the living rock of the Serpent's Tooth Peak, a place of sharp angles and cold magic that made the surrounding stone ache with violation. She saw its layout as if from above, the guard posts, the main gate, the deep, dark pit of the interrogation chambers, and there, in the deepest cell, she saw Finian. He was chained to a chair, his head lolling. A quiet man stood over him, not with weapons, but with hands that glowed with a vile, emerald light. He was not asking questions. He was peeling back the layers of Finian's mind, searching for the Cartographer's knowledge, for the locations of the other forgotten battles, for the names of his allies. Elara felt an echo of Finian's agony, a silent, mental scream of someone having their very self unraveled. He was fighting it, clinging to fragmented maps and coded symbols, but his strength was fading, his memories beginning to blur at the edges. The vision was a white-hot brand, searing her resolve. She did not pull back. She pushed further, absorbing the brutal details of the stronghold's defenses, the patrol routes, the number of guards, searing every stone and shadow into her own memory, no matter the cost. The psychic damage was a tangible thing, a cracking sensation deep within her mind, but she held on until she had it all. When she was pulled back to her body, she collapsed, blood trickling from her nose and ears. Her limbs trembled uncontrollably, but her eyes, when they opened, burned with a cold, singular fire. "They are breaking him," she gasped, her voice raw. "I know where he is. I know the way in." The quiet scholar was gone, replaced by a field commander. The quest was no longer about recovery. It was a rescue mission, a direct assault on the heart of the enemy. Every moment of planning, every weapon forged, every step of the march would be measured against the fading light in Finian's eyes. The war for memory had found its battlefield, and they would not be late. The stronghold's corridors were a labyrinth of polished obsidian and cold, blue torchlight. Elara moved like a ghost, her path guided by the stone memory seared into her mind. Every shadowed alcove, every echoing footstep, confirmed the psychic map she had paid for in blood and pain. They found Finian in the deepest chamber, the air thick with the scent of ozone and despair. He was slumped in his chair, his eyes vacant, the vibrant cartographer she knew reduced to a hollow shell. As Kalin cut him loose and Gideon stood guard, a door hissed open behind them, revealing not a squad of guards, but a single robed figure. The man lowered his hood, and Elara's world fractured. It was the High Chronicler, the most revered scholar in the realm. the man who had personally decreed the Hall of Whispers forbidden. His face, once a symbol of wisdom and authority, was now a mask of cold calculation. "You were always my most promising student, Elara," he said, his voice calm, almost paternal. "And my greatest disappointment, the erasure is not a relic of the past. It is our most vital, ongoing duty." A tense silence filled the room, broken only by Finnion's ragged breathing. The chronicler did not call for guards. He began to lecture, his words a well-practiced justification. He spoke of fragile human nature, of wars sparked by inconvenient truths, of the chaos that follows when heroes are celebrated for terrible, necessary choices. "We do not hide the truth out of malice," he insisted. "We curate it for the greater good. A society needs a stable foundation, not a collection of tragic, morally complex stories that would shatter its faith in its leaders and itself. Order is built on a carefully managed narrative." Elara listened, her initial shock hardening into a cold, clear fury. She saw the quiet men not as monsters, but as instruments of this man's sterile, utilitarian philosophy. He had built a cage of lies and called it peace. A society that is stable only because it is blind does not deserve its stability, she countered, her voice low and resonant with the echoes of 100 forgotten sacrifices. "It deserves to see clearly, no matter how painful the sight. You have not protected us. You have infantilized us. You traded our collective soul for a quiet, comfortable lie." The debate was over. There was no compromise between his curated order and her raw, dangerous truth. Looking at the broken form of her friend, Elara made her final choice. She would not try to reason with this man or escape quietly. She would burn his perfect, orderly world to the ground. With a swift, decisive motion, she slammed her hand onto a large, glowing rune set into the wall, the stronghold's central alarm. A deafening, pulsating shriek erupted, echoing through every corridor. The High Chronicler's calm facade finally cracked, his eyes widening in disbelief and rage. The conflict was no longer a secret war. It was an open declaration. The ideological line was drawn, and Elara had chosen her side forever, leaving the ashes of her old life and its lies firmly behind her. The alarm's shriek was not a sound but a weapon, shredding the stronghold's sterile silence into 1,000 panicked fragments. While Elara faced the High Chronicler's cold fury, Gideon became the storm. He led Cadden down into the bowels of the fortress, a whirlwind of controlled violence. The elite guards, the quiet men, were waiting, their movements a chilling ballet of precision. This was not a skirmish. It was a brutal, room-to-room purge, a desperate fight where every parry, every dodge was measured in inches and breaths. Gideon's strategic mind mapped the chaos, turning choke points into killing zones, while Cadden's blade moved with a feral grace, each strike fueled by the memory of Finnion's capture. They found him in a cell that reeked of broken minds, his body frail but his spirit a stubborn, flickering flame. He was unbroken. As Cadden shouldered his weight, the tide of battle turned against them. Reinforcements flooded the lower levels, herding them into a dead-end chamber, the main exits sealed by heavy portcullises of enchanted iron. They were cornered, their backs against the cold stone, the triumphant silence of the quiet men closing in. It was then that the mountain itself answered their plea. Their golem ally, having followed the seismic echo of the alarm, slammed into the corridor behind the guards. But this was not the quarry's patient guardian. This was a being at its end, cracks spider-webbed across its stone body, glowing with the intense, unstable energy of its final effort. It did not attack the soldiers. Instead, it turned its massive fists inward, slamming them into the chamber's supporting wall with a deafening, final roar. It was sacrificing its own structural integrity, its ancient consciousness, to give them a chance. The wall exploded outward in a shower of rock and dust, revealing not a polished hallway, but a ragged opening to the frigid night air and a treacherous slope leading down into the wilderness. The golem's form crumbled into a silent, unmoving cairn, a monument to one last, unrecorded hero. They scrambled through the breach, the cold wind, a slap of freedom and loss. They had saved Finian, but the cost was immense. They were now fugitives in truth, their faces etched onto wanted posters across the kingdom, their crime a thirst for truth. The quiet war was over, a final public confrontation with the crown and its curated lies was no longer a choice. It was an inevitability barreling toward them all. The gray pass where Kalin had made his last stand now teemed with a sea of living, breathing faces. Elara stood on a simple stone platform, the wind whipping at her hair, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Below her stretched a crowd of thousands, scholars who had risked their positions, farmers who had walked for days, artisans, merchants, and even a handful of nobles whose silken robes stood out like rare flowers in a field of wool and leather. They had all come, drawn by whispers of a truth long buried. This was the gathering of echoes, a conclave called not by a crown, but by the weight of the past itself. Her evidence was not locked away in a vault. It was here, living and breathing in the redeemed heroes standing behind her. Gideon, his head held high, no longer a disgraced exile. Kalin, bearing the restored journals of his ancestor. Finian, leaning on a staff, but with a fire in his eyes that the enemy's cells could not extinguish. Their very presence was the first argument against the Chronicles' lies. The air grew taut, the murmur of the crowd shifting into a nervous ripple as a line of polished helmets appeared on the ridge. The royal guard, flanked by the silent, ominous forms of the quiet men, moved to encircle the gathering. Steel glinted in the sun, and the order to disperse echoed across the pass, a cold command against the warm hum of humanity. This was the confrontation she had known would come. Elara felt the fear of her allies, a palpable tension, urging her to flee or to let Gideon form a defensive line. But she made a choice that defied every instinct of survival. She handed her own small knife to Gideon and stepped to the very edge of the platform, completely unarmed and utterly exposed. Her faith would not be in steel, but in the stories she carried. She began to speak, and her voice, amplified by the natural stone bowl of the pass, did not shout. It was calm, clear, and heavy with the sorrow of centuries. She did not start with dates or tactics. She started with Kalin, the warrior whose ghost haunted this very ground. She spoke of the feel of the mountain air, the scent of pine and blood, the terrifying silence of the shadowy tide he faced. She made them feel the desperate grip on his sword, the burning in his muscles, and the single, driving thought that fueled his final moments, the twinkling lights of the fleeing families in the valley below. She made his sacrifice not a dusty fact, but a human reality. Then she turned and pointed to the Ashen Fields in the distance, telling the story of the silent soldiers who let a plague claim them to save a kingdom. She spoke of the Thalassian Admiral who died a traitor to save a fleet, and she gestured to Kalin, the living proof of his redemption. With each story, the crowd's nervousness transformed. It became a shared, breathless attention. People wept openly. They were not just hearing history. They were feeling the echoes of love, duty, and sacrifice that the crown had tried to erase. The quiet men advanced, their collective will of pressure against the gathering's morale. But as they moved, something extraordinary happened. A woman in the front of the crowd, a common baker with flour still dusting her apron, stepped directly into the path of a quiet man. She did not shout. She simply stood there, her arms crossed, her gaze steady. Then a burly blacksmith from Boren's district joined her, then a dozen more, then 100. They did not form a violent mob. They formed a living wall, a barrier of ordinary people who had just remembered their own capacity for courage. The royal guards hesitated, their orders suddenly meaningless in the face of this quiet, collective defiance. Elara's speech was more than words. It was a key, unlocking a truth that had been sleeping in the hearts of her listeners. The power of the past was not in changing what had happened, but in awakening what could be. The fate of her movement hung on this single moment, and as she looked out at the sea of determined faces, she saw that the battle was already won. The truth, once spoken to a listening world, could never be silenced again. Her voice did not echo with the cold authority of a decree, but with the raw, trembling timbre of a shared memory. Elara did not recite a list of forgotten battles. She wove a tapestry of individual souls, her seer sight allowing her to paint their final moments with heartbreaking clarity for the thousands gathered in the past. She spoke of a young soldier at the Weeping Willows, not as a faceless casualty, but as a boy from a coastal village who carved seabirds into his shield, who died holding a line so a girl with hair, like his little sister, could escape. She told them of the healer in the Ashen Fields, a woman who hummed a lullaby as she drew the plague from a child into her own body. Her final breath, a whispered name that was not her own. Each story was a pebble dropped into the still pond of the official history, and the ripples became a wave. A collective gasp moved through the crowd, followed by soft weeping, then a low, building hum of outrage. The foundations of the Chronicles, built so carefully on lies, began to crack under the weight of this resurrected love. The disruption came as a slash of cold order against the warm emotion. The crowd parted, and the High Chronicler strode forward, his pristine robes a stark contrast to the dusty, tear-streaked faces around him. A phalanx of royal guards flanked him, their armor gleaming. "Silence her," he commanded, his voice cutting through the air. "This woman trades in sedition and forgery. She is a traitor to the crown's peace." Every eye turned to Elara, the tension so thick it was difficult to breathe. She did not look at the chronicler. She turned her gaze instead to the young soldiers in the guard, their hands tight on their spears, their faces uncertain beneath their helms. Her next words were for them. She spoke of the silent stand, of soldiers who followed impossible orders not for a king, but for the people behind them. She asked them if their oath was to a comfortable lie, or to the protection of the very sacrifices that had made their homes safe. She was speaking to the hidden honor in their own hearts, reminding them of the duty that existed before any decree. The moment shattered the simple dynamic of enforcer and rebel. This was no longer a speech. It was a battle for the soul of the nation, fought not with steel, but with the undeniable power of a truth that resonated in every conscience present. The crowd's mood shifted from sorrow to a volatile, protective energy, their loyalty pivoting from the symbol of authority before them to the woman who trusted them with the world's painful, beautiful reality. The fate of the kingdom now hung on which memory the soldiers would choose to honor. A ripple of motion cut through the stillness of the royal guard. One soldier, his face pale beneath his helmet, took a half step forward as Elara spoke of a forgotten siege, of a guardsman who used his own body as a shield for a group of children trapped in a burning chapel. The story was not a grand epic. It was a quiet, terrible moment, and the name she spoke was one the soldier knew from his own family's hushed stories. It was his great-grandfather. The official record listed the man as a deserter. The truth, now ringing in the mountain air, was that he died a hero. The soldier's spear clattered on the stones, the sound shockingly loud in the tense silence. "I will not raise a hand against this truth," he declared, his voice trembling but clear. He turned to face the High Chronicler, his defiance a spark in dry tinder. Another guard followed, then a third, their weapons dropping to the ground in a growing, discordant chorus of metal on rock. The authority of the crown did not shatter with a roar, but with the quiet, decisive sound of abandoned duty. The High Chronicler stood frozen, his face a mask of stunned fury. The power he wielded, the power of curated narratives and enforced silence, evaporated in the face of this simple, human recognition. His own enforcers were becoming witnesses. The scene teetered on a knife's edge. The remaining loyalists, outnumbered but heavily armed, gripped their weapons tighter, their eyes darting between their commanding officers and the sea of defiant civilians. A single shouted order, one panicked sword thrust, and the pass would become a charnel house. The tension was a physical force, a held breath waiting for the spark of violence. Elara saw the danger instantly. She raised her hands empty and open, and her voice cut through the chaos, not with a command, but with a plea. She turned to her own followers, to the angry blacksmiths and weeping farmers who stood ready to charge. "Stand down," she ordered, her words ringing with a fierce conviction. "Do not fight them. Our victory is not in their blood, but in their awakening. We will not answer their lies with our violence." Her command was an act of profound faith, cementing her message not with force, but with an unwavering commitment to peace. It was the final, undeniable proof that her cause was one of restoration, not destruction. The moral victory was absolute, a seismic shift in the soul of the kingdom, but the political landscape now lay in ruins. The crown's military was split, its foundational myths publicly dismantled. The High Chronicler, his power broken, was led away by his own disgraced quiet men. There was no clear authority left, no unified hand to guide the realm. The kingdom did not have a new ruler. It had a truth, raw and disruptive, and it teetered on the precipice of a chaos, born not from lies, but from a painful, newfound clarity. The war for memory was over. The far more dangerous war for the future had just begun. The polished marble floors of the Grand Archive, once a symbol of absolute order, were now a battlefield of ink and ideals. Elara led her allies not as invaders, but as restorers, their goal to physically rewrite the nation's story. They carried with them the 24 recovered histories, not as scrolls to be hidden, but as truths to be permanently bound. Their mission was simple, audacious, and utterly revolutionary. They would inscribe the forgotten battles into new, leather-bound volumes and place them on the sacred shelves, side by side with the official chronicles that had denied their existence. This was not an act of destruction, but of completion, a surgical strike against the heart of the lie. But the old guard would not surrender its narrative without a final, desperate fight. Loyalist archivists, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and fury, barred the way to the main scriptorium. They wielded not swords, but heavy ledgers and razor-sharp lettering knives, their attacks aimed at the very tools of their trade. Behind them, the last few quiet men moved with a grim finality, their presence casting a chilling silence in the hallowed halls. The conflict was a bizarre and brutal ballet, a clash of pens and parchment against the unyielding resolve of those who remembered. In the midst of the chaos, Elara became a living symbol of her own quest. She fought with a scribe's stylus in one hand and Kalin's memory crystal in the other. She did not stab or slash with the metal point. Instead, she used it to parry a swinging ink pot, to disarm an archivist lunging with a knife, her movements a desperate defense of the very act of writing. The crystal in her other hand pulsed with a soft, sapphire light, a constant reminder of the blood and sacrifice that made this fight necessary. She was defending the truth with the instruments used to uncover and record it, a perfect, poetic circle of rebellion. The stakes could not have been higher. This was the final act of reclamation. The battle was not for a throne or a fortress, but for control of the story itself. Every volume they saved, every page they inscribed, was a direct assault on the curated reality the High Chronicler had built. A loyalist managed to seize a newly bound history of the Weeping Willows and made to hurl it into a blazing fireplace. Cadden tackled him, the two men crashing into a shelf and sending a cascade of official lies tumbling to the floor. The fight was for every name, every silent stand, every whispered song that had been stolen from the people. When the last quiet man was subdued and the final loyalist surrendered, a profound, ink-stained silence fell over the scriptorium. The air was thick with the smell of torn vellum, spilled ink, and sweat. Elara, her hands trembling, walked to the great, empty shelf reserved for future histories. One by one, she and her allies placed the 24 new volumes into the vacant space. The books stood solid and real, their spines a testament to a past that could no longer be denied. They had not just won a physical fight, they had permanently altered the most sacred repository of knowledge, making the forgotten conflicts an unerasable part of the public record. The archive was no longer a temple to a single, clean story. It was now a library, housing the beautiful, complicated, and painful truth of a nation finally willing to remember itself. The High Chronicler's sanctuary was a cavern of controlled knowledge, the air thick with the scent of old leather and polished wood. Elara found him standing before his great oak desk, his hands resting on a single, massive volume bound in white vellum, the master copy of the official chronicle. A small, ornate oil lamp burned beside it. His movements were not frantic, but deliberate as he lifted the lamp, his intent clear. He would burn the original lie rather than see it supplanted. Elara did not rush forward. She simply stepped into the room and let the door click shut behind her. "You cannot unwrite the truth by burning one more page," she said, her voice quiet but firm in the hushed space. The stories are already walking the streets. They are in the hearts of your former guards and the songs of the bakers. All you would destroy now is the last chance for your own name to be remembered with any nuance. He froze, the lamp hovering over the precious book. This is not malice, he insisted, his voice a dry rasp. It was always a burden, a terrible duty. Order is the highest virtue. Chaos is the price of your so-called truth. And what is the price of your order? She asked, gesturing to the silent shelves around them. We have paid it in the currency of forgotten souls. You built a quiet, stable world on a foundation of graves and called it peace. This is the final choice. You can help me write a new master copy, one that tells the full story, the 24 battles, the silent stands, the redeemed heroes. And it will also tell why you did it. It will include your philosophy, your reasons, your belief that humanity needed to be protected from its own past. Your name will be in that book, not as a monster, but as a man who made a catastrophic miscalculation. Or you can burn that book and walk out of here. And in the history that I will write without you, you will only be the villain who tried to erase love and sacrifice from the world. The choice is yours. How do you wish to be remembered? The lamp trembled in his hand. The certainty that had defined his entire life was crumbling to dust around him. He looked at Elara, no longer a renegade student, but the embodiment of every inconvenient truth he had ever buried. He saw the futility of it all. The lies had not created a stronger society, only a more fragile one, and his life's work was now a monument to cowardice. A profound weariness settled into his bones. With a slow, defeated exhalation, he set the lamp back on the desk, his fingers leaving smudges on the polished brass. He did not look at her again. He walked past her, out of the office and out of the archives, a solitary figure disappearing into the city he had tried to shape with silence. He chose exile over infamy, and in doing so, he ceded the narrative forever. Elara stood alone in the sudden quiet, her hand coming to rest on the cool, white cover of the Master Chronicle. The institution built to curate reality had been hollowed out and was now hers to fill with a louder, more beautiful, and more painful truth. The victory was absolute, but it tasted of ash and left a hollow space where a formidable opponent had once stood. The work of memory was complete. The harder work of building a future worthy of those memories was just beginning. The ink was not black, but a deep, resilient blue, mixed with flecks of ground, memory crystal. Elara dipped her pen, the silence of the grand archive pressing in around her. She was no longer a renegade, but a chronicler, and the blank page of the new master volume was a territory more daunting than any forgotten battlefield. Her first stroke began the story of Kalin. She wrote of the scent of pine and blood, the shifting shadows, the twinkling lights in the valley. She inscribed his sacrifice not as a solitary act of glory, but as a thread woven into the fabric of the nation's survival, a truth that gave meaning to the peace that followed. This single entry formally ended the age of curated silence. The Chronicle of Whispers was no longer a hidden secret, but the foundation of a new, integrated history. Yet as the ink dried, the first cracks in their hard-won unity began to show. Around her, the debate erupted in hushed, fervent tones. Gideon, his own honor so recently restored, argued for a harsh judgment of the old regime. They were cowards and liars, he insisted, Their names should be recorded as villains, their philosophy condemned without mercy. How else could justice be served for the centuries of disgrace his family and so many others had endured? Cadden, however, whose ancestor was an admiral wrongfully branded a traitor, saw a more complex shadow. He understood the terrible weight of a choice made for a perceived greater good, even a wrong one. If we paint them only as monsters, we become a new kind of chronicler, he countered. We simplify the past just as they did. The argument threatened to splinter their alliance before the first page was even turned. Elara listened to the conflict, her pen poised above the parchment. She understood both sides, the raw need for vengeance and the cautious wisdom of context. Then she made her decision, one that would define the character of their new era. She did not write a polemic. She wrote with compassion. She acknowledged the High Chronicler's fear, the genuine, if misguided, belief that humanity needed to be protected from its own painful history. She recorded his philosophy in full, giving it space on the page, and then, with the same pen, she unequivocally detailed its catastrophic cost. She established the primacy of truth, not as a weapon to bludgeon the past, but as a balm to heal its wounds. The stability of this new beginning now hinged on a fragile balance. Could they forge a single, inclusive identity from a history of both profound courage and systemic deception? The work of reclaiming the battles was over. The far more delicate work of healing the memory of a nation had just begun, and every word she wrote would be its first tentative medicine. A faint, sickly green light began to pulse from the foundations of the Grand Archive itself. The High Chronicler stood at the central dais, his hands pressed against the master copy of the old chronicle, his final words a whisper of pure defiance. You may have the books, but the memory of a people is a more fragile thing. He channeled the last of his authority into a spell woven into the very stones of the city, a failsafe of absolute oblivion. A wave of nullifying energy erupted outwards, a silent, expanding sphere that did not shatter buildings, but sought to shatter thought. As it washed through the streets, people stumbled, their faces going blank as the newly learned names of Kalin and the Thalassian Admiral were plucked from their minds. In the archive, the ink on the new volumes began to fade, the letters blurring as if exposed to a great heat. Elara felt the spell as a cold vacuum in her soul, a suction trying to pull the very stories from her grasp. To fight it with force would be to feed it. She understood its nature in that terrible instant. It was an emptiness, a void that consumed memory. You cannot fight a shadow with a sword, she realized. You must fill it with light. She closed her eyes and did not reach for her own power. Instead, she reached for the connections, the psychic echoes of the 24 battles, now woven into the city's subconscious. She became a conduit, a focal point for every whispered name, every forgotten sacrifice. She called to the memory of the silent soldiers in the Ashen Fields, and their steadfast resolve became a shield. She called to the song of the druids from the Verdant War, and its pure notes became a counter-melody to the silence. She called to Kalin's final thought, to the Admiral's chosen course, to the Golem's last roar. A brilliant golden light erupted from her, not a single beam, but a tapestry of countless individual sparks, each one a story, a face, a moment of love or courage. This was not an attack. It was an offering, an overwhelming flood of remembrance. The erasure spell, designed to create a void, was suddenly filled to bursting. It could not hold the sheer weight of so many truths. The green light flickered, strained, and then shattered like glass, not with a bang, but with the sound of a million sighs of relief. The faded ink on the pages darkened once more, permanently fixed. The people in the streets blinked, the names and stories rushing back, now etched into them more deeply than ever before. Elara collapsed to the floor, gasping. The victory was absolute. The city's memory was saved, but as she looked inward, she found only a profound and personal silence. The psychic echoes that had been her constant companions, the seer sight that had shown her the halos of heroism, the direct connection to Kalin's pain, and the Golem's sorrow, it was all gone. She had used them as the fuel for her counter-ritual, burning out her own connection to channel their collective power for everyone else. She could still remember the facts, the stories she had written down, but she could no longer feel them. The warmth, the immediacy, the soul of the memories she had fought so hard to reclaim, was now a gift she had given to the world, a gift she could no longer personally hold. She had saved the history books, but in the process, she had become the only person in the kingdom who could no longer hear the whispers. The city's memory was restored, but Elara's own mind was now a quiet place. She walked through the bustling streets, a figure both celebrated and solitary, watching as a new understanding took root in the people around her. A baker, once just a woman who made bread, now spoke with pride of a great uncle who had stood in the Ashen Fields. Children played at being Admiral Thuron, steering imaginary ships away from Leviathans. The truth was no longer a secret to be uncovered. It was becoming the soil from which the city's future would grow. Elara felt a deep, resonating fulfillment, a knowledge that her life's purpose had been served, even as a profound personal emptiness remained. The magical echoes that had once been her constant companions, the scent of pine from Kalin's pass, the silent resolve of the soldiers, the Golem's final roar, were gone, sacrificed to fuel the great remembrance. She could recite every story from the 24 battles, but she could no longer feel their warmth. She had given the heart of the memories back to the people, and in doing so, had become the one person who could no longer hear their whispers. She was no longer an archivist bound by rules, but a living monument to the cost of truth. In the rebuilt Grand Archive, a new generation of scholars now worked, their voices a vibrant hum, where once there had been a curated silence. They did not see their task as complete. Their mission was one of vigilant care, an endless commitment to seeking out the overlooked and the silenced, ensuring that no act of courage, no matter how quiet or complex, would ever be erased again. They understood that history is not a fortress to be defended, but a garden that requires constant tending. Watching them from a sunlit doorway, Elara allowed herself a quiet, weary smile. The greatest chronicles, she knew, were not the ones preserved in leather and vellum. They were the stories still being lived, the choices being made, the quiet heroes of the present whose tales were only just beginning. Her work was done, but the work of memory, she saw with a final, peaceful certainty, was truly endless.